Hello everyone. So for chapter 7, we are going to be covering photosynthesis, where plants or photosynthetic organisms are going to be able to convert light energy into food, chemical food. Biofuels are energy sources obtained from living material. When we obtain or derive energy from biofuels, we are tapping into the energy from the sun. And in the cells, living cells, the same solar energy is converted to the chemical energy of sugar through the process of photosynthesis. So this chapter will look at how photosynthesis works. And then, like cellular respiration, I have decided to pare down this chapter. I just want to cover the key concepts, the things that are more important, less focus on the finer details and more on the actual goal or results of photosynthesis. So an introduction to photosynthesis. Plants, algae, and some photosynthetic protists and bacteria are photoautotrophs. Photo meaning they obtain their energy from sunlight. The producers of food consumed by heterotrophic organisms. So plants, algae are probably the biggest ones, but there are some bacteria that are photoautotrophs. The blue-green bacteria, for example. And then just to compare, photoautotrophs or autotrophs create their own food, where heterotrophs have to consume food, either plants or animals or other material, to obtain the energy that they need to survive. The structures or molecules that they need to use in cellular respiration, for example. So this is just an example, or just to show you the variety of photosynthetic organisms on the planet, from the many plant species that cover most of the surface of the planet. And then you have, this is algae, this is kelp. Probably the great kelp forest off of California. That's a great example of that. And then here at the end is bacteria. These are, there can be single-celled algae, colonial algae that are still microscopic, to bacteria that's very similar to this, like oscillatoria, for example. But there are many, many types of organisms on the planet that are photosynthetic. So photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts of plant cells. Chloroplasts are surrounded by a double membrane, very similar to mitochondria. However, they contain stacks of what we call thylakoids and a thick fluid called the stroma. Chlorophyll is the light-absorbing pigment in the chloroplasts, and it plays a central role in converting solar energy to chemical energy. There are many types of pigments, but chlorophyll is the main pigment. It is the one that is responsible for reflecting green light, so it is responsible for why most plants and algae are green in color. So this is just a summary of the breakdown of where chloroplasts are found. So in a leaf, if you do a cross-section of a leaf cell, you'll get this. This is the cross-section of a leaf. You'll notice this leaf has pores on the bottom of it called stoma. And stoma allow for gas exchange to occur. They allow for carbon dioxide to enter into the leaf and oxygen to leave out of the leaf. But yeah, this is the cross-section of a leaf. If you were to focus then on an individual cell of the leaf, what they call a mesophyll cell. So this is the cell of the leaf. You can see all of the many chloroplasts that are inside of these cells. So then if you focus in on just one of those chloroplasts, you will get a structure very similar to this. This is the 3D structure of a chloroplast, and this here is just a transmission image of a chloroplast. And you can see that there are stacks of thylakoids inside the chloroplast, and then the fluid is called the stroma. So some words, similar words, stoma and stroma. Stomas are the pores that allow for gas exchange in leaves, and stroma with an R is the fluid that is inside the thylakoids. So just be careful of those two terms. They're very similar, but they have the stroma has an R in it. So photosynthesis, like respiration, is a redox reaction, which means that oxidation and reduction occurs. Certain molecules are reduced and some molecules are oxidized, very similar to cellular respiration. So in photosynthesis, the water molecule is oxidized and carbon dioxide is reduced. And so it is these redox reactions. It is the transfer of the hydrogen molecule. It's the bonding. Once again, the energy is stored in the bonds of these molecules. And so this is just the summary of the photosynthesis equation, where in photosynthesis, you need energy, carbon dioxide, and water to create a sugar molecule and oxygen gas. And you can see where the carbon dioxide becomes reduced and the water molecule becomes oxidized. So photosynthesis occurs in two stages, very similar to cellular respiration, in that you have the light reactions that occur in the thylakoids, in the membranes of the chloroplast, where it produces ATP and NADPH, which will be used for the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. During the Calvin cycle, CO2 is incorporated into the organic compounds in a process called carbon fixation. So carbon will be fixed or added to the compounds that are in those processes. And this is the equation for photosynthesis once again. With light energy, carbon dioxide, and water, you can create glucose and oxygen gas. Where glucose is what is used, the plant wants glucose molecule, but the oxygen gas is a waste product. Plants don't need oxygen, but thankfully, because of their oxygen producing capabilities from photosynthesis, we now are able to have oxygen-rich atmospheres. We need oxygen for cellular respiration. So this is just a summary of the two cycles, the two stages of photosynthesis. You have your light reactions that occur in the thylakoids, where light and water is required, where oxygen is released as a waste product. And the light reactions will produce ATP and NADPH, which will be used in the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide to create sugar. So the goal of photosynthesis is to create a sugar molecule. So let's talk about the light reactions converting solar energy into chemical energy. So the sunlight is a type of energy called electromagnetic energy or solar radiation. In certain wavelengths of visible light are absorbed by chlorophyll and the other pigments. Another pigment type is the carotenoids. The carotenoids, carat, you see the prefix term here is carat. So these are the orange pigments. And they function in photoprotection from excessive light. So this is the electromagnetic spectrum here at the top, and it covers all the different types of light. And then you have from your gamma rays, which are very tiny, strong, to X-rays, to UV light, ultraviolet light. Then you have your visible light, which is right here. It is a very small sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, to infrared, microwaves, and then the very, very large waves, which are radio waves. And so as you travel along this spectrum, the larger the wave, like infrared to microwave to radio waves, these waves they're larger in size. This is the size here. So radio waves are very extremely large, which is why they can travel such large distances around the world. But their energy is not as concentrated. So radio waves are not as harmful. The larger the wave, the less harmful. The smaller the wave, though, gamma rays are very dangerous and deadly to organic life. It's UV rays, UV light, for example, which is called what causes our sunburns. So the smaller you get, the more damaging that they can be. But visible light is the light levels that we can see. You can see this is visible light, and these are the wavelength numbers of the lights here in nanometers, where red, extreme red, is 750, purple light is 380. So shorter the wavelength, higher the energy, longer the wavelength, lower the energy. And so plants have different pigments that will absorb light at different wavelength levels. And there's some levels where the pigments just do not like, which green light is one of those levels. The reason why plants are mainly green is because that light is reflected away. It is not absorbed by the pigments that are in the chloroplast. So sunlight hits the thylakoids, and most of the colors of light are absorbed by pigments except for green light. It's reflected, and so plants will appear green. So photosynthesis captures solar energy. Thylakoid membranes contain photosystems. These are what we call light harvesting complexes, and it has a reaction center. In that reaction center, there is a chlorophyll A molecule, pigment, a chlorophyll A pigment, that receives the excited electrons that will be obtained from the energy of sunlight. So this is just to explain how a photosystem works. You have sunlight, a photon of light, that will hit a chlorophyll molecule. And when it hits that molecule, the energy from the photon is going to be transferred into the electron. And that electron is going to jump from a ground state to an excited state. Okay? So the more energy that that electron has, the further away it can jump, travel away from the center of that chlorophyll, from the ground to the excited. And then as it starts to lose energy, it will drop back down to the ground state. As it loses energy, it either releases its energy as heat or as light. This here in this image, this is just an image of, it's basically chlorophyll pigment. That's being harvested from leaves, and they have shined a black light on it, and it's causing the all the chlorophyll, which is normally would appear green, to appear pink or red because it's now excited. It's jumped from its ground state to an excited state, and so you can actually see a difference when it's excited. So here is a more accurate diagram of a photosystem. And so it's showing you that in the photosystem, light energy will come in and it will hit a pigment. So each one of these green discs here represents pigment molecules. So as light hits one of these pigment molecules, and they can be different kinds of pigment molecules. That's the beauty of the photosystem. There's usually many kinds of pigments here that specialize in absorbing different kinds of light. So as the light hits this pigment, the electron will be excited. However, that electron can't stay there. Once again, as I use the analogy in cellular respiration, that as the electrons have gained energy, they're not able to stay in one place, so the molecules will pass them on from one to the other. So almost like a game of hot potato. So they will pass along this electron, they will transfer it until it gets to chlorophyll A. These are the chlorophyll A. So chlorophyll is the electron, the main electron pigment, acceptor pigment. And so when it receives that electron, chlorophyll A will send the electron to a molecule, which we're just going to call the primary electron acceptor. So this guy will just grab that electron and it will hold onto that electron. So you got to ask a question. So in this process of when you capture the energy from light that's been given to the electrons, you'll notice that this pigment here then technically has lost an electron. How do you replace that electron? You can't just go without an electron. Well, that's where we'll learn about the splitting of water molecules in a second. So there are two photosystems that are required or needed for the light reactions. And the names of the systems, honestly, may seem backwards to many people. But photosystem 2 was discovered after photosystem 1. So that's the reason why their names are given the way they are. Where photosystem 2 is actually the first system that occurs in the cycle in the transfer of the electrons, but it was the second discovered. So I kind of wish they would just drop the numbering system on the photosystems, but here we are. So photosystem 1, so energy is going to be given in the form of sunlight, and it's going to be transferred to the electron. And this is supposed to demonstrate how the energy is transferred and the electron gets knocked from the ground state to an excited state. And then as this is the electron acceptor, they're going to pass that electron down the electron transport chain, which will create ATP. Then it will get to photosystem 1, which this process will repeat itself, where in energy from sunlight here, from a photon, is going to cause that electron to be excited again, send it to a higher state, where it's then going to be passed to the energy carrying molecule NADPH. And then, of course, I do have an image of how all this is going to work, but let me just go through these first parts, and then I'll review everything in the image again in a second. So in the between the photosystems is the electron transport chain, and this is photophosphorylation. So the electron transport chain pumps hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space. Now this should seem very similar to cellular respiration, and it is. The electron transport chain works very similar in both concepts. Hydrogen ion is transferred across the membrane and it creates a concentration gradient, which then ATP synthase, which was also found in cellular respiration, is going to undergo chemiosmosis and create ATP, a lot of ATP. So this is the overall light reactions, and let me just run through it right quick. So you have the first photosystem, which is photosystem 2, where light will hit those pigments. The electron will be transferred to chlorophyll A, which will send it to an electron acceptor. And then the electron acceptor will send it down the electron transport chain. This is the electron transport chain. As that electron travels down the electron transport chain, hydrogen ion is then pumped across the membrane. So remember earlier I mentioned you should have been asking the question, how do you replace this electron? This is where you replace it with water. So in photosystem 2, this is where water molecules are split. Some of the electrons from the water molecule are used to replace the electron that was moved or lost here in the photosystem. So oxygen gas is now a waste product, and then the hydrogen ions are now part of the inner membrane space, which helps create a higher concentration of hydrogen ions here. As the electron travels down the electron transport chain, it will then get to the second photosystem, where it will get used by the pigments, and then the light will excite these pigments again. This process will repeat. The electron will get excited. The electron acceptor will then send it to another molecule, the electron, to be used to create NADPH. The NADPH here is then going to be used in the Calvin cycle. As all of this occurs, you're creating a hydrogen ion gradient here in the inner membrane space. And so just like in cellular respiration, with its ATP synthase, in the light reactions, ATP synthase works the exact same. So these hydrogen ions will travel down through the gradient here. It will travel into the ATP synthase, which will funnel it or fuel it to turn. And as it turns, hydrogen ion will be released into the outer membrane space. But it will cause this wheel to turn, and it will bind ADP and phosphorus to create ATP. So just like in cellular respiration, here in the ATP synthase of the photosynthesis, a lot of ATP is produced in this step, a lot of ATP. So where the goal of cellular respiration was to create a lot of ATP, That's not the goal of photosynthesis. The goal of photosynthesis is to create sugar. So we now have to go to the second part, which is the Calvin cycle, to create our sugar molecules. So the Calvin cycle, reducing carbon dioxide to sugar. There are steps in the Calvin cycle: carbon fixation, reduction, the release of G3P, and the regeneration of RUBP. Those are the four main steps of the Calvin cycle. And overall, it's a process that uses carbon dioxide and the electrons from NADPH and the energy from ATP, which come from the light reaction, to help construct a glucose molecule. And this is just a summary again of how all these steps work together. And so here is the overall Calvin cycle. So in the Calvin cycle, the plants, for example, must allow for gases to come in. They must allow for carbon dioxide to come into the leaf, so that carbon dioxide can be taken into the cells to be used in the chloroplast. That carbon dioxide is stored in the stroma of the chloroplast. So what will happen here is that Rubisco, an enzyme, will capture carbon dioxide and it will bind it to RUBP, creating a molecule with 6 different molecules of 3 carbons molecules. This step here is carbon fixation. So basically, it's just the fixing or grabbing of the carbon dioxide off of carbon dioxide and adding it to and creating a new molecule. So then, with the help of ATP, the energy from ATP, and the energy from NADPH, a series of chemical reactions will occur where you will transfer and reduce into a G3P molecule. It's a 6 G3P molecule. So now you have an extra and you have excess here. So you can drop off one of the G3Ps. This is one of the goals of the Calvin cycle, is to produce a 1 G3P molecule. So then you have 5 G3P molecules that then need to be recycled and help regenerate RUBP. So with a little bit of energy here, you can create RUBP. Now, if you was to go through and you was to count the number of carbon molecules, you will notice that the only molecules, carbon molecules that are actually being changed or repurposed are the ones from carbon dioxide that has been repurposed and used to create a G3P sugar, which has 3 carbons in its molecular structure. So the overall goal of the Calvin cycle is to produce G3P. G3P is half of a glucose molecule. So the Calvin cycle has to run through twice. This has to occur twice to create 1 glucose molecule. So this here, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle, is the cycles that are probably the most common, the most common form of photosynthesis. We call that C3 plants. In C3 plants, a drop in CO2 levels and rise in oxygen levels when the stomata close will divert the Calvin cycle to photorespiration. Photorespiration is bad. Photorespiration is when you use the carbon, you use up all the carbon dioxide in the Calvin cycle, and then you're left with nothing but oxygen. And when oxygen is present, when you have high levels of oxygen present, you would then, the plant cells would then undergo, instead of photosynthesis, they'll undergo cellular respiration. And that's not what the plant wants. That's not what the chloroplast wants to do. They don't want to undergo cellular respiration. That is the job of the mitochondria. That's not the job of the chloroplast. So different kinds of plants, different plants that live in different kinds of climates or environments have to adapt to times or periods when there are low CO2 levels. And this leads us to C4 plants and CAM plants. In C4 plants and CAM plants, they fix carbon dioxide into a 4-carbon compound instead of a 3-carbon compound found in C3 plants. And it is this different compound that will then save the carbon dioxide to be used in the Calvin cycle, even when the stomata is closed on hot, dry days. So basically what has happened is that these plants in these different environments have learned to be able to hold or save their carbon dioxide. So C4 plants, they do this by separating the stages of photosynthesis into different cells, where there are certain cells in the leaves of C4 plants where their only job is to gather carbon dioxide. And then you have the bundle sheath cells, and their only job is to undergo the Calvin cycle. It is this, it's a partition of space here in C4 plants. They have separated jobs into different spaces. So, so some examples of C4 plants would be sugarcane. This would be a lot of your grasses. Corn, for example. Corn plants are C4. And they are very common in areas such as the lower Midwest to the southern United States to the Mexico region. There are a lot of C4 plants that live in those areas, where here in North Carolina, you will have some C4 plants, but most of the native plants here will be C3 plants. The other type of photosynthesis is CAM plants, where they have learned to, very similar to C4, diverge their stages of photosynthesis, but they do so more based on the time instead of space. So CAM plants, the example given here is like pineapple. The other great example of CAM plants would be cacti. A lot of desert plants, plants that grow in very hot, dry climates, are CAM plants. So it's better, for example, cacti to open their stomata at night and to allow carbon dioxide to enter into the cells, because it's cooler at night. They're less likely to lose a lot of water. And so the carbon dioxide will be taken in at night. And then during the day, daytime, when you need sunlight to undergo photosynthesis, that carbon dioxide will be stored and will be able to be used in the Calvin cycle. And so that plant can undergo photosynthesis in the daytime. So there are 3 different types of photosynthesis, 3 different types of plants with photosynthesis, C3, C4, and can plants. So now let's talk about the global significance of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is basically responsible for all the food and oxygen for almost all living organisms. So cellular respiration occurs in plant cells. Plants have mitochondria. They also have chloroplasts. But it is those mitochondria that uses about 50% of the carbs made from photosynthesis. The other 50% go into building the plant. So 50% of the sugar that is created from photosynthesis is used by mitochondria to create more energy, and the other 50% go into creating other organic molecules or building the plant, going into creating cellulose or sucrose or starch that can be stored and used by the plants themselves. And so this is just a summary of photosynthesis once again. It's an overall summary of how a leaf here, which needs water molecules, which the plant can get from the soil, and it needs carbon dioxide, which it gets from the air through the stomata. And so this is showing you the summary of the light reactions and the Calvin cycle and all of the components that are needed or created in these processes. And then when sugars are created, the end result of photosynthesis, how they are used throughout the plant for many different functions. I also want you guys to think about how photosynthesis can relate to global warming and changing temperature levels and atmospheric conditions with the increase of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And so scientists have been studying the increase of carbon dioxide. And while at first glance you would think that an increase of carbon dioxide could lead to more carbon dioxide being available that could be used in photosynthesis, that's not always the case. There could be other detrimental effects that happen to the environment which can negate the increase in carbon dioxide. And so I just want to highlight Duke here. Duke has built and have been for years studying carbon dioxide levels, and they have these amazing, really amazing towers or bubbles that have been built and created to basically give those plants inside that area more carbon dioxide. I've actually been here and seen these up close. I had a friend who was studying the effects of changing temperature, where these towers actually not only can release CO2, they can also increase temperatures, which is really cool. So this is just showing you that, yes, if carbon dioxide is needed for photosynthesis, if you increase carbon dioxide, then you also increase plant mass over time. However, this can have a negative effect in different ways. You can affect the plant in different ways because not only are you changing the atmosphere, you're changing everything else that's going along with that. The ability for changes in temperature or being able to hold different amounts of moisture in the atmosphere. So which, while elevated CO2 may be good on the short term, it can actually be harmful on the long term. But then let's also think about what would happen. Is there a way to actually help remove CO2? Yes. So one of the benefits, one of the things that we can do, one of the benefits of plants using carbon dioxide in photosynthesis is that, yes, with more plants on the planet, more plants there to use CO2, the more that they can help take CO2 out of the atmosphere and reduce the greenhouse effect. If we can remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, then we can lower our CO2 levels. But one of the main, reasons why we are having such climate change is because of deforestation around the world. It is the cutting down of large forests. Large areas of land are being cut down and converted into, for example, the parts of the Amazon are being cut down, converted to farmland, which is only fertile for a few years, and then that area is not able to recover as quick back into tropical land. And so once you clear cut those forests, they're not able to recover, and so you've lost that plant material that normally would have been there. You've lost that plant material that would normally be absorbing a lot of CO2 and using it to grow its plant species, but it's no longer there. So deforestation is actually, in my opinion, and there's a lot of research and other scientists that will agree with me that it is the #1 reason for why our planet is undergoing such a fast changing climate. Later on this semester, we're going to come back to climate change, and we're going to talk more about that in more detail and how we should approach different aspects of conservation. But for now, that concludes our lesson on photosynthesis.